Welcome to another episode of The Marrow Show, presented by Marrow Ministries, hosted by Luke Walker, Nick Kenicott, and Alexander Wade. So all truth is God's truth. All right, cool, let's go. All right. Welcome to another episode of The Marrow Show, brought to you by Marrow Ministries. Today, during our conversation, we are going to talk about what I would say is a fact, but some would call an opinion, that all truth is God's truth. All right, so that's what we're getting into today. Tune in. If you're watching this online, go ahead and hit that like and share button so other people can join in and enjoy this content as well. I'm here today with Pastors Luke Walker and Nick Kenicott. And guys, all truth is God's truth. That is a very simple statement, but people have argued about this for a long time. As a matter of fact, in the past, we have argued about this. All right, so
It's true.
and for our OGs out there, the people that have been rocking with us for a long time, y'all know, y'all have heard these conversations, all right? But all truth is God's truth. Nick, when we say that, when we use that phrase, what are we trying to communicate by saying all truth is God's truth?
We are communicating the fact that God has created all that exists. And so if we identify that something is true, we recognize that it has ultimately come from the hand of God. We can all acknowledge, I hope, that not everything that we know in this world comes from the Bible. We believe everything the Bible teaches is true and infallible and inerrant when properly understood. But the Bible also doesn't teach us things about certain aspects about this world. And so we have to acknowledge that there are true things that exist, that have been given to us by God, and they are true. Now, in addition to that, what we mean by that is that people who are not Christians, or people who may even have a disdain for the Bible, can say true things. And we have to acknowledge that when things are said that are true, and maybe even beneficial to us, that that also comes from God, even though the person saying or writing those things may not acknowledge that very fact.
Yeah, Luke, what would you add on to that?
Yeah, so one of the ways that theologians have talked about this is that there are actually two books of God's revelation. There's the book of Scripture, of course, but then there's the book of nature. Nature would be the physical universe we live in, including us and our brains and all we're able to figure out, and that God is the author of both of them, that He's revealed Himself through creation, like Paul says in Romans 1, and that He's revealed Himself supernaturally through the Scriptures. So, but all of it is the revelation of the same God. The God of the Bible is the God of nature, and vice versa. So some of the differences there we can get into. What makes the Bible unique? Why do we need the Bible in addition to nature and all that? But on the surface of it, we just say that all of it reveals God, so that, in everyone's life, every day when they're moving about in the world, and God is present and revealed to them, and they know God is real. Everyone, even unbelievers, He's evident everywhere. He's made Himself known everywhere. So all creation reveals Him in that way as the ultimate truth, of course.
Yeah, so I think, obviously our base, the folks who watch and listen to the Marrow Show and hit the share button with their friends, the people who, really matter out there in the world. This is a Christian audience, right? So I don't think there's any debate that Scripture is a source of truth, and that according to Scripture, nature is a source of truth. I think where I've had some good conversations is when we find what we believe to be pieces of truth in maybe other religious texts or
Hmm.
something like that. Like, man, this seems to be true, even though the source, the where I'm getting this kernel of truth, overall, I would say it's not a trustworthy source of truth overall, but there are kernels of it in there, right? And so, how should we think about that, right? How should we think about other religious texts or secular unbelievers, atheists who teach us about how the universe works, but at the same time deny the God who created it, right? So, Nick, how have you thought about that over the years?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is actually, I've spent many years dedicating a large part of my life and study to these things. In fact, these are the very things I teach for the Reformed Baptist Seminary. You can check it out at rbs.org in our classical studies program. But this is an important question. This has been asked throughout the centuries in the history of the church. Tertullian asked very famously, he said, "What hath Athens to do with Jerusalem?" And there he was dealing with the relationship between Christianity and secular philosophy, guys like Plato and Aristotle, and on through the philosophical canon. So there have been different ideas. Obviously, he was not a fan and did not believe that secular philosophy had anything to offer. But Augustine responded to that about a century later, and I'm reading this quote. He said, "If those who are called philosophers, and especially the Platonists, have said aught that is true and in harmony with our faith, we are not only not to shrink from it, but to claim it for our own use from those who have unlawful possession of it." And the way I've thought about that through the years is essentially that Christians have a right, and I would even argue a responsibility, to plunder from the Egyptians. That ultimately that we recognize that because truth is from God and we are God's people, that truth is our rightful possession. It's not something that we just hand over to the secularists and say, well, you said it, you've denied the God that you know exists, as Luke was talking about earlier. You've denied the reality of the world all around you, and therefore, we can't take possession of what you have revealed that is true. No, quite the opposite. They have stolen from the Christian worldview, in a sense, to posit true thoughts about the world. And I'll give you one more quote here from John Calvin. He said, "In reading profane authors, the admirable light of truth displayed in them should remind us that the human mind, however much fallen and perverted from its original integrity, is still adorned and invested with admirable gifts from its Creator. If we reflect that Spirit of God is the only fountain of truth, we will be careful, as we would avoid offering insult to him, not to reject or condemn truth wherever it appears. In despising the gifts, we insult the giver." And I think that is so very well stated. These are from God. We can't despise the truth that is presented, even if from profane authors, speakers, philosophers, poets, whatever the case may be. But this has been an argument that's gone on since the beginning of the church.
If y'all are listening, you're probably thinking, yo, how did Nick just off the cuff just have these he didn't know what question I was going to ask. He didn't know, but he got these quotes just ready to go. Right. So I'm sitting here thinking, how did he do that? Right. Because if you're one of our subscribers, you get the bonus content. You can see the footage of Nick in his office. He didn't pull up a book or nothing. He just had it ready to go. And I figured it out. I didn't know this before. I used to think Nick was really smart, but it turns out that he has tattoos of famous quotes on the inside of his leg. So when he sits with his leg, he sits with his leg crossed, and he looks smart. And then when he needs a quote, he can just pull up his pant leg a little bit, and he's got Augustine quotes, Tertullian quotes. Who else? Jordan Peterson quotes, all tattooed on his calf. And if you're a subscriber and you get the backstage pass, man, you can see all the bonus content, and you could see him rolling up his pant leg and reading those quotes. So I was like, man, how did he get that so fast? He didn't even have a phone in his hand or nothing. It was awesome. But yo, I'm with you, man. Right. So I think one of the things that was interesting, Nick, that you pointed out was, man, this is not a new debate, right? You went all the way back to the patriarchs, right? We're talking like second and third century conversations, asking these same questions. Hey, what do we do with the truth that we find in places and by people who deny God? And so when I think about this, and I'm thinking about maybe a young believer who's hungry for the truth. Luke, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. Have you ever pastored or counseled somebody who is hungry for the truth and will look everywhere for it but the Bible? And it's just like, yo, like it's not that there aren't kernels of truth to be found in these other places or sources, but I tend to steer people away from that if they're not a mature believer, because they don't have the means to or the tools to really parse through these things without getting tossed back and forth. So, Luke, have you experienced that, and what have those conversations looked and sounded like to you?
Yeah, good question. I have. For me, it's usually somebody who is more of a deconstructor from the Christian faith, and usually somebody who has never actually read the Bible. They kind of grew up in church and they're familiar with Scripture, the stories of it and stuff. But so to them, it's just commonplace. It's nothing special. They're looking for something more exotic. So they'll be searching in other religious texts or searching in other, spheres of consciousness and trying to find the hidden truth. So yeah, you encounter that, and so in those conversations, I've tried to just affirm wherever I can, affirm the truth that they're holding to, even if it's just a little bit. Try to affirm that, and then also bring in scripture that they're probably not familiar with, scripture that would affirm that, or even church history that would affirm those things, that these are actually part of the Christian religion as well. So that's been a way I've tried to draw people in to that. But yeah, you encounter that, especially if you grew up in a Christian culture or where the Bible is commonplace. You feel that it loses its mystique. And so you got to go out there to find the truth. So that can be kind of frustrating. But like Nick was saying, and like your other question, Wade, there is truth in religious traditions. There are basic truths in there. And so to affirm those and try to build on those, in the same way Paul was able to flip that out in Acts 17, that's a benefit. My younger self would have just been, just smashing those down and rebuking all of it. But now I've tried to just more build on those commonplaces when I get a chance in a conversation like that.
Yeah, I was about to ask, you brought up Acts 17. What can we learn from Scripture about how we can use truth, found extra biblical truth, to redirect people back to the truth of Scripture and back to the one true God?
Yeah. So Paul there, Acts 17, he's quoting. It's a poem to Zeus, right? It's a poem to Zeus, but and he quotes it that we are all his offspring, and applies it to the one true living God. And so what you have there is that God created human beings as theologians. We're all created to be theologians. We're created to know God in a capacity that none of the other creation has. We have a capacity to know God. So even mankind in his fallen brokenness, he knows certain things about God. He knows God exists. He knows God is the creator of all things. He knows that he's a sinner and somehow needs to pay for that sin or wash it away, and every false religion has its version of that. And so, Paul seems to grab out those big things, those things that everybody knows, but when you bring it from somebody's own source, it tips the conversation. So I've quoted rap lyrics off the cuff sometimes if I'm ministering on the street or something. I can't remember any examples, but sometimes something will come to mind where maybe a secular artist will affirm some aspect of truth that maybe you're talking about or trying to get at.
I think this is actually a very underdeveloped field of study, is the Bible's interaction with sort of secular ideas of the time. What we often forget as we read Scripture is that this is all done within a cultural context, and a context in which there were ideas that were prominent. There were writings that were very prominent, and if we forget that as we read the Scriptures and jump immediately to sort of our own context and what we believe and understand today and how we think through issues, then we're going to miss these things. I think as well, sort of in the Western educational pursuit, we've gotten far away from reading and understanding a lot of the even pre-New Testament things that have been written, and so we don't see the interaction, the interplay that takes place between the biblical authors and some of these, especially the philosophers of their day, or even prior. So, for example, I would say I very strongly believe, having spent a lot of time studying, for example, Plato's Republic, that Paul is leaning very heavily on those arguments, and that sometimes using examples from the Republic, sometimes arguing against some of the ideas presented in the Republic. For example, I'll tell you his entire thing in 1 Corinthians with regard to the body. We're all members of the body. A head can't say to the hand, "I don't need you." That whole thing that Paul writes about there. Well, that is. It would take a lot of convincing for someone to show me that that's not actually taken directly from Plato's Republic. And I think the book of Romans, for example, is in many ways an interaction with some of those ideas. So, that shouldn't alarm us. He's dealing with a people who would have been fully immersed in these ways of thinking and this literature. It was very prominent, sort of on the street in terms of the day-to-day talk. If you were listening to the cable news stations of the time, if you will, this is sort of the dominant worldview of the people, especially in the places where Paul was ministering among the Gentiles. And so, if we don't know the literature, we won't see it because it's not explicitly stated in the same way that we see in Acts 17, for example, where he gives the hint, where he says, "as some of your poets have said." As opposed to, it's there, you just have to be able to do the comparison and find it. But I think it's much more prevalent in the Scriptures than most people realize.
Sounds like you did a lot of study on Plato. So maybe you can answer this question for me that I've had for some time. How is it, or what's the connection between Plato and the word platonic, meaning friends with no benefits?
Well,
Was he just a dude that he just had a hard time finding a companion,
He got friend zoned.
and then so he got friend zoned all the time, and then it just became platonic?
I haven't studied the etymology of the word Platonic. However, I would assume that it has something to do with Plato's argument about how society should be formed, and he had a sort of wild vision of a society in which families were sort of shared entities, that your children belong to the community. You have sort of this almost a if you will, a swinger culture of society. So now the argument comes as to whether or not Plato was advocating for that, or he was talking about that as a possibility and arguing through whether or not that was a good idea. But I don't know for sure. That would be my guess, but I don't have a solid answer for you on that.
See, that's when you know you got nerdy friends, when you can just throw out a random joke that shouldn't make no sense whatsoever. He still kind of made sense out of it. But at the same time, I did see him switch to his other calf for that one. So, I don't know. He switched that leg real quick, man. He said, hold on, let me pull my sock down for that one. All right, y'all. So, but yo, all truth is God's truth, man. So, man, we've hit this a little bit in the scriptures, and one of the things that I want to talk about when we talk about all truth being God's truth. One, that's just that's a bold claim, right? And so we kind of are just assuming that that's true, but what basis do we have to say that all truth is God's truth, right? We can, obviously we got the scriptures, and the scriptures talk about nature. And then we've seen some examples where the scriptures are engaging some other writings. But to say that all truth is God's truth, to say that if something happens to be true in the Quran, well, that truth belongs to the God of the Bible, right? That's a bold claim, right? So if somebody's listening to that and maybe they're having a hard time wrapping their head around the boldness of that claim, on what basis can we say that?
Yeah.
What do you think, Luke?
Well, all truth is God's truth. I mean, God is the truth. God is not a liar. Just like we say the Ten Commandments reflect God's character. You shall not bear false witness. Reflects God's character. God doesn't bear false witness. He speaks the truth. He creates the truth. So anything that is because God made it that way. If you like say a mathematical truth, or you said like astrophysics, with like Neil deGrasse Tyson, brilliant astrophysicist. Those are God's truths because that's the way that God made the universe. So all truth reflects him, especially religious truth. Wherever you find truth about the nature of God as creator, as us, like I said, us as creatures, that we have broken God's laws and that we are sinful. You will find those things littered throughout all religious literature, and humanity can't escape those truths because they're realities, the realities in which we live, they're realities that we understand. The atheist is working to suppress that truth because it's so evident in themselves and in everything around them and everybody around them.
Now, truth, we've done conversations in the past, and maybe we need to revisit this, about truth, beauty, and goodness, about these transcendentals, right? And so when we're talking about how all truth belongs to God, and I think there's an important distinction to be made here, not in that God isn't truth simply because he always is truthful, but he's always truthful because he is the source of all truth. Right. Like you know what I'm saying? Like, and I know that might seem like a small little nuanced thing to say, but why is that important to make that distinction?
Well, it's because is God truthful because he happens to get everything right, where he could be wrong about something? That puts God on level with creation. But because creation flows out of God, then he is the source of that creation and the source of all its truth. And he doesn't just happen to get it right. It is right because it comes from him. And he understands it fully. God understands what he has made in a way we can't even comprehend, including ourselves. The way God knows us. And, you see David come up with this in Psalm 139, and the way that God understood him in past, present, future, and the way that creation proceeds from God. It's entirely dependent on him. And it's not like he just made it, and then flung it into existence and now it's on its own. The Bible teaches that every moment he upholds it. So he's stewarding his creation every moment, and we are suspended in his creative act. And because we're all in that, he understands us and everything else in here completely thoroughly, because we're all flowing out of his creative act. So it puts him on a different level with truth. It's not like he searches out truth. The Bible speaks that way sometimes metaphorically, but it's not like God finds anything out or ever learns anything.
I want to emphasize how important I think it is that Christians not only understand this, but are ready to articulate this more and more in our current sort of cultural climate. Again, these questions aren't new. You can think back of when Jesus stood before Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate was sort of determining, what am I going to do with you? Everyone's calling for your blood, and Jesus says, for this purpose I was born into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. And Pilate's response to him is the very same thing we hear from our sort of postmodern thinkers today, and really has permeated into every sector of society. And the question is, what is truth? And if Christians aren't steadfast in their commitment to say that truth is not only from God, but it all belongs to God, and it exists because of God, then we sort of lose the very thing that the Scriptures are pointing us to say there is true, there is false, there is right, there is wrong. And if we can't stand on that, then we've sort of lost the very thing the Bible's pointed us to.
So Nick, I want to flesh this out a little bit more, right? Because that's a crazy good question that we need to nail down. One, what is truth? And then I think not just what is it, but how can we discern it, and how can we know that we have identified the truth versus a lie? We're going to talk about that in the next episode. We're going to continue this conversation. If you've enjoyed this conversation, man, there's plenty more, right? You can go to marrowministries.org. Go on there. All of our past episodes are on there. There are articles about a whole bunch of various topics. And then, man, also you can subscribe. You can become a monthly subscriber. One, we just appreciate your support. It helps us to continue to put out more content like this. But also you'll be able to get behind the scenes footage that includes some fun conversations and stuff like that. So go ahead and go over to marrowministries.org today and subscribe. All right. Check out the website and share this stuff with your friends, but leave some stuff in the comments, right? So far, we've been talking about all truth is God's truth. What questions do you have? What comments do you have? Leave that in the comments below, and we'll be happy to engage you guys. So this is part one of the Marrow Show. We're talking about all truth is God's truth. We're going to continue this conversation. Tune in next week to wrap up this conversation. All right. We'll see you guys next time.